These are some of the most important topics when, and the most important things that you have to do to scale to 8 figures a month, or excuse me, 8 figures or $1 million a month. And, I would never sit here and say that having an 8 figure sales operation is easy. That's not the point of this video or any of the videos. But there are a lot of simple truths and first principles that I just see so often missed that really work against you. Right. And so without these concepts that I'm going to go over a lot of them. Without these concepts, it just slows you down immensely. And so the goal here in this video is to break down step by step some of the main principles and concepts of creating rapid scale, of getting to that 8 figure mark. And I'm not just going to talk through all of these, different principles and concepts here. I'm going to go in depth on these things, but then also over here later in the video, once I've explained these concepts, I want to actually show you what that looks like in a spreadsheet. I'm really big on the financial models, and so I want to show you how that applies and what it actually means in terms of numbers. What's up, guys? My name's Josh Troy. If you don't know who I am, I'm reporting directly from the trenches, giving you raw and unfiltered content that shows you what it actually looks like to build and scale 8 figure sales operations and manage high-intensity sales teams. This isn't theory. This is how it actually works right now. This channel is dedicated to the soldiers that are actually in the trenches doing the deal. So let's first start off by talking about, what I believe are like the main principles to creating rapid scale. And I've obsessed around scaling businesses for over a decade. And when I always used to think about this, I'd be like, well, how do I just put it in the most simple terms, what it means or what the philosophy is to scale as fast as possible? And they're really these two things right here. You first have to map out a predictable growth engine. If you have any type of revenue momentum, you probably know this. Or if you're having trouble getting consistent month over month momentum, you're probably recognizing that's why. And once you have that, it's all about removing the constraints to scale. And so everything starts with revenue, right? You want to map out revenue and go to the bottom down. You don't want to hire all these people operationally when you still haven't solved for revenue. The revenue is the driver, not only of the business, but in any type of financial model that you might build, right? It all is usually fueled off of the revenue, off of the top line. And so to give you an example of this, a simple example that would apply to most sales operations businesses, if you're watching this, is that really early on in my business, when I was mapping out how we're going to consistently grow the revenue, it was very easy to see that one of the most important, the largest constraints to scale was going to be hiring more sales reps. That's probably true for most anyone watching this video, right? It was hiring more sales reps, and not just hiring more sales reps. It was about having top performers. Because if I have a business, I run an outsourced sales business. If that's my service and I do all the recruiting, managing, training, scaling of the sales reps and all the operational stuff, and I can't even attract and retain top talent, I don't have a business model. So knowing that, the faster we scaled, the more revenue we generated for clients, the more sales reps we needed, I knew from day one, I wanted to actually build the business around the constraints. And that's a really big piece of advice that I want to give, because I think a lot of people, and this is a lack of doing some of the financial models I'm going to show you here shortly, when you don't have that clarity on how your business evolves over time and what it operationally means at different levels of revenue, then you don't get the insight into some of the biggest bottlenecks that you're going to face. And so what happens is you wait till you get there, and revenue usually declines as you sort those things out. So if you can anticipate what the biggest constraints and bottlenecks in the business will be and the challenges at scale, now you can start from day one to build a business that has those value engines. So instead of hitting these plateaus and going backwards, you have that kind of hockey stick growth sort of analogy, which is why for us, in the first few months, I said, first couple of months of business years ago, I was like, we have to be a recruiting first business, because that's one of the most critical things of our business. That's why I hired a director of talent acquisition quite a bit before we actually needed that person, right? Now, for high ticket info product businesses or coaching businesses, again, this is true for most sales operations that scale through phone sales. But for coaching businesses, we're in a direct response industry. Now, I obviously understand you may have organic, engines as well. They're less predictable. They can be predictable if you consistently produce results over a certain amount of time and you're tracking the individual stage metrics. But, mostly it's a direct response industry, which means you cannot scale revenue without scaling ad spend. And I'm not talking about back-end ascension and all these other things that you could do to increase LTV. I'm just simply saying the way to scale is you have to scale your ad spend because that's what generates more leads. And so if we're talking about predictable growth engine and the constraints to scale, the growth engine is you're going to have your funnel, or I like to call them customer acquisition models. You have to scale the ad spend, which is the predictable growth. And the main constraint here is going to be increasing call capacity, which means you have to hire sales reps, right? So we know this. This is a very simple understanding, but I'm going to show you what we could do with that information to create velocity in how we scale using financial models here in a moment. Now, there's really only two prerequisites to scaling ad spend, right? If you really think about it, if you really know what you're doing, and this is why, one of my favorite quotes ever is, it's not the business, it's the businessman, right? How can you take the same exact type of business, and some people scale at an exponential growth rate year over year, month over month, maybe even week over week, and then some people have the same business and they sit there and they never grow, right? And it's a lot of it is these scaling concepts here. So there's really only two prerequisites to scaling ad spend. You want to hit a minimum ROAS because you'll hit a minimum level of profitability. You don't want to scale if you're losing money. You're just going to lose money faster. So you're going to have your ROAS and profitability metric. And then your the second prerequisite is that you're increasing call capacity. Because the more leads you have, the more calls there are. If that's going to be limited by your sales rep capacity. Now, there could technically be a quasi third, I suppose, which would be an operational constraint, operational lag, or fulfillment bottlenecks, right? Now, in the coaching space, or even in the SaaS industry, which I refer to as non-inventory based products, because, which is another reason the gross margins are so high, but you're selling information and or you're selling a software where it doesn't require additional fulfillment technically. One of the reasons by definition they're so scalable is because you don't have the consistent need to scale fulfillment at the same rate. So to me, that's not really a prerequisite to scaling ad spend, but you do have to be conscious, obviously, that you can keep up with the fulfillment demands as you meet new revenue levels. But other than that, if you're hitting ROAS, if you're increasing call capacity, you can scale as fast as you possibly can, which brings me to what I always refer to as the golden formula, right? Now, these things are compounding upon itself, and I'm about to show you in the spreadsheet with this next bullet point here. These are all kind of compounding, but we call it the golden formula. One of the things I try to do is take the most complex concepts in scaling, because I am not a fan of fluffy, BS. I like to go really deep, an inch wide and a mile deep on these subjects. But I like to try to do it in a way that really simplifies it, because I'm not a fan of adding complexity to scale. And things that are confusing typically don't scale, and confusion slows things down. So if you really think about this as a whole, there's one formula that we own in direct response. Lead flow times sales performance equals revenue. But the thing that I'm so passionate about is that sales performance, whether it's good or bad, that's besides the point. My point here is how often companies are not hitting this revenue target in the desired output just simply because they don't start with the proper input. And I just found this to be a fascinating concept over time, because I think that it's a very simple principle, and I would almost use the word obvious, right? But the amount of relationships and engagements I've had in this business and past businesses, I've been in direct response for a lot of years, the amount of times that the lead flow did not change, but the client's expectation was that this would increase month over month. It happened all the time, and it was so weird to me, right? It's like, well, why would that happen? Yeah, maybe there's a small performance delta with sales continuing to improve, but to have a material difference, we need more lead flow. That's the driver in the model. That's why like I said, we start with the predictable growth engine. And so anytime you're building a forecast, you want to align around these two things. And so this brings me to the next point, which is getting extreme clarity on, how the business is scaling and at each level of scale. So this is what I call building your business in a spreadsheet. And I build every business in a spreadsheet. I actually was on a podcast just yesterday, and somebody asked me, they said, Josh, you're a very unique individual in the sense that you're an expert at sales and an expert at financial models. What do you think you're better at? And I was like, that is tricky because it is a superpower. Both of those are a superpower of mine. And the reason I love spreadsheets and financial models so freaking much, I'll tell you guys, as honest and bluntly as possible, I started building financial models so I could sleep better at night. Because in a previous business, things started scaling faster than I had ever had experience with. Maybe to some, there's always somebody more successful out there. So maybe to some people it wasn't that fast. To me it was, and we were doubling our business in a rapid pace. I would just have so much anxiety at the end of the day. I couldn't shut my head off because I didn't have visibility on what that meant. I didn't know, like, well, what if the conversion rate goes down by this much? Like, do we lose money? I just didn't have any of that visibility. And so I just started making my own models and spreadsheets, and it became a superpower. Today, I am really of the belief that, like, you can't scale a business. You can't be a sophisticated operator if you don't have an extreme amount of financial fluency and you're not building your business in a spreadsheet, consistently looking at sensitivity and scenario analysis and forecasts and all the things like that. I have a mentor of mine, someone I respect a lot, hundreds of millions in exits, and he told me that he was so naive early in his career that he thought that marketing was how you drive a business's growth when he believes that it's all in the financials. And I thought that was super interesting because by knowing the financials, it gives you the clarity to give you the speed and the decision-making power to know what to do next, right? To know how to grow the company faster or increase reinvestment strategy, whatever it is. And so that's sort of the thesis that I come from. So when we're building our business in a spreadsheet and we're talking about these concepts, I'm always building budgets. Now, what I'm going to show you today is it's a financial model, right? It's you could also refer to it as like a working model. That's something where I'm building a financial model around a specific thing. I'm not building like an annual budget, although of course I always have those and we're always looking at them. But what's really cool and why I suggest you do that if you have aggressive and ambitious growth goals or revenue milestones is because you want to see how your business evolves at different levels of scale, right? You could see how this information I'm presenting is sort of compounding on itself, because if you see at a certain level of revenue, you might see that, oh, wow, I need to hire this many reps. And then you think to yourself, oh, shoot, I didn't even think about this. But like at that point in time, now I have so many reps, that's more than one sales manager can handle. I need a second manager that I'm going to need to hire at that point. And then maybe at a different level of scale, you're like, well, who's going to manage the fulfillment department? I need a director of fulfillment. And so by giving you that clarity as revenue grows, you can be preemptively hiring and building the business instead of reactively. And so the way that I always start, we map out the growth engine and the revenue drivers, map out the operations and the capacity assumptions, get clear on hiring schedules and assumptions. And that was a good example of that, right? Like, so when you get clear on the capacity, maybe you say, hey, for every sales manager I hire, they can manage 10 reps or 15 reps or whatever that number is for you. Well, now when you hit certain levels of revenue, if it shows that you would have 20 reps or 30 reps, you know that you would need 2 or 3 sales managers by that point, right? And again, I worked with somebody a long time ago who he taught people how to scale businesses, and in a concept that I came up with when I was working with him was a crystal ball operator, right? Like you could just get so much clarity that you could almost like see the future, and that's what enables that speed, right? Then lastly, you do your expense assumptions and model it all down to net profit. But what I would urge you to do, don't make the mistake that I see so many businesses make where they're like, well, I'm just going to force scale and I'm going to sell my way there and I'm going to use brute force. Build your business in a spreadsheet. You will make such better decisions. And unfortunately, when you're not doing these simple things that I'm showing, and you don't even need to know how to do it yourself, just pay an accounting firm a relatively cheap price to build these things for you. But when you don't do that, you could literally build the entire business the wrong way because you start hiring positions that are the wrong positions because, like I said, you're not just seeing how the business fluctuates and changes over time, right? So it brings me to these questions right here. So now you start thinking about, what does your operation look like at that level of scale? And I know that's a question a lot of you watching this want to know if we're talking about $1 million months and 8-figure businesses. So let's jump over to the spreadsheet now. And we want to look at things like, how many calls does that take? How much revenue per month? Right? Well, in this case, if we're talking about $1 million a month, that's the answer. How many customers and clients do we need? What does the management team look like? What's the org chart consist of? How many sales reps are needed? So again, when we can scale the budget out and when we can look into the future at the desired levels of revenue and what that would mean in terms of P&L and in terms of, an org chart and an operation, now we can start aligning on these things as actual targets and managing against those things. And so let me show you over here a couple of financial models. Let me minimize myself. I'll move it if it gets in the way of something I'm explaining. And let's talk about the types of things that I'm consistently doing with my clients and the things that I'm just doing on a daily basis. And I'm going to point out some really interesting things. I think there's no matter what somebody says, I actually, I'm not going to, that would give away maybe potentially who I'm referring to, but there was somebody that I worked with on some projects, and this person would just adamantly say, I do that stuff in my head. And I'm very good at numbers. Like I am gifted with numbers. This stuff just makes so much sense to me, and I've done it for so long. And I'm just telling you, like, you cannot do this stuff in your head. You get the most insane insights by putting it in a spreadsheet. And sometimes you're like, wait, how does that even make sense? It's things that are so counterintuitive. And so what you're looking at, by the way, right here, you can see it's our funnel financial model projections template. I actually have this for every single type of customer acquisition model here, right? No, I'm not going to give this whole thing away. It takes a long time to build. So don't ask that in the comments or reach out to me. But I am going to show you, and you could screenshot or whatever you want to do. I'm going to break down one thoroughly. And so what I do here is I choose, remember the first thing, there's two steps, map out predictable growth and then remove the constraints to scale. Well, if it's direct response, you have to choose your customer acquisition model that's going to generate the lead flow and revenues, right? We have to narrow down the funnel, and sometimes you'll have more than one. So let's look at a VSL because it's just a standard call model, which is why I wanted to do it, right? So if we start with the VSL, what we do is you just build, you map out. There's a bunch of layers to this that I'm going to break down, but we want to map out all the different individual stage metrics here. And you have to start with a set of assumptions, right? So it's pretty easy math, by the way, in these formulas. By the way, in case anyone's wondering, because I think the only assumption that's not visible here is the CPMs. And I'm just using a 5-cent CPM, which I think equates to a $50 CPM. Do the math. It's 5 cents an impression, right? That's pretty normal unless you have a much narrower audience, which means you're going to have higher CPMs and cost of impressions. Like I have a campaign right now that I think's at like 8 cents an impression. So anyways, just do the math to figure out what the impressions are. And then I have all the assumptions here. Now, where do I want to go? Where do I want to go first? So the point is, so I'll start with this. Garbage in, garbage out, right? That's the one thing about financial models. You may have heard that before. If you just put a bunch of shit in the model, you're going to get a bunch of shit out. Like, let's make this realistic to actually work for us. And so a big question is, well, where do you get those assumptions? Again, on that podcast I was on yesterday, I got asked that. And, excuse me, what I would say is, first of all, I have all the assumptions because I've just been in the trenches as long as that I have for all these different funnels. But just ask somebody. It's very simple. In certain industries, there's like all these different data websites where you can pull industry benchmarks. For the coaching space, for the SaaS space, it's so dynamic. There's not a lot of like public information, things like that. So just ask somebody that you know. You have to know somebody. If you don't, this is your sign to go meet somebody that knows what they're talking about in the space. And just ask what is realistic targets here. And then as you start to get brand specific data to optimize towards, then you can swap those things out. But for a call model, I'm not saying never look at my models and take it as is like truth or gospel, because this is just my experience and maybe I pulled it from a specific recent example, but they are meant to always be realistic here, right? In these different assumptions. And by the way, if you're wondering why I put 100% opt-in rate, that's just me assuming that this specific VSL or book a call page doesn't have an opt-in, right? So sometimes you'll have an opt-in wall, you opt in and then watch the VSL. I'm just saying, no, I just want the VSL with the call to action right on that page. So I just put 100% there. I didn't delete the row in case I want to come back later and add an opt-in rate, right? Now, I'm not going to break down every single piece of this because that would get sort of long and boring, but I will tell you, one of the truths to scaling fast is doing the boring shit. This is why so many people skip this stuff, because they think, I don't want to do it because it isn't necessarily fun. I would challenge you to say it's the most fun thing to do once you understand how to do it and realize the amount of money it could make you. So anyways, let's look at this. If you have, I guess we could reverse engineer. If you say you want to do $225,000 here, and these are all of your metrics, we could see that you would have to spend 50 grand to be able to back into that, which generates in this instance a 4.5x ROAS. Now, here's what I mean when I say look at the operation at different levels of scale. So 50 grand, well, how many calls would you need? You'd need 375 calls. Now, a number I always like to play with, I always like to break it down into dailies because this is over a month, of course. So I always assume 22 average working days a month. So 375 divided by 22. So that means you need 17 calls a day to do almost $250,000 a month, right? That's not that many. Now, this is giving you insight on the marketing funnel. In a moment here, I'm going to show you how we look at capacity and breaking down the rep stuff, right? Now, what this model, this is like a 3-scenario model that I usually always do. I always have these 3 different scenarios, and I'm testing certain things. I don't like to, sometimes I will if I have to, but I don't like to have more than one variable different between each model, because now you're just, the level of probability of accuracy decreases. And so in this model, you could see I'm just testing if we had a higher show rate. In this model, you could see I'm just testing if we had a higher close rate, right? So you could look at what that would represent. Now, this is a basic model that everybody should be doing. And then while you're actually building your marketing campaigns, you're testing against the actuals, which I'm not going to go into that because this isn't a marketing video. Now, what I wanted to show you is a much more advanced model, which I don't always do, but if I want additional clarity, and this is the type of stuff I constantly get asked about, if I want additional clarity about what it looks like, what it would look like at that level of scale, what are the different things that I do and what are the different tools I use? Well, I'm going to start with this. So first of all, I'm going to change this to 50. If I just copy and pasted this over, so this is the same model to begin with. The only difference is I used a 60% show rate across the board, if you're wondering, and a 15% close rate across the board. There's no scenario difference here, right? So if I model this out, we already said it's 375 scheduled calls. But then what I like to do is I build capacity planning based on this. Now, financial model shows all the financials. An activity model is when you're not building a model in a spreadsheet to necessarily analyze financials. An activity model is when you're building a spreadsheet to analyze capacity, right? To analyze the amount of hours or output something would take. And so if we have 375, I just pulled down, you can see it just equals D26. If we have 375 total booked calls, 22 average working days a month, like I said, it's about 17 calls a day. If our rep, if a closer can only take 6 new calls a day, assume they're an hour long or whatever, then we would need 3 closers, right? You see how that works? It's so important to look at. Now, let's go up here real quick, though, and we can play with this. And I play with these over and over again. That's to generate 270 grand worth of revenue. Well, and it says it's a 5x ROAS, so I'm going to guess this is roughly 200 grand would get me around, 200 grand would get me roughly around $1 million right here, right? Well, what does that look like? Well, I would need 12 closers. By the way, I'll also tell you that's about $80,000. The average rep is generating $80,000. It's not great from a performance perspective, but I would say it's pretty close to industry average. You'd want them to be over 100, 1 to 150. The good ones can do obviously significantly more than that. But again, this is all modeled out over, in this instance, a 10% close rate, right? Or excuse me, 10% close rate. And I'm going to show you how this works in a second here. So now you might see there's 2 close rates, and that's what I want to break down next here. So here's one of the big concepts. Let me go back to the sheet over here for a second, right? So we're playing with the model to understand the business. I think it's right here. No. Here's what I want to show you. We'll talk about this. So, and I think I actually just went over this. We're just talking about what it would look like at these different levels of scale, right? To hit $1 million a month, we're asking ourselves, well, how many calls does that look like, right? How many reps do we need? Or how many calls a day can a rep take, and how many reps do we need? Let me show you this really quickly because I wanted to show you one more thing on that. So we said that's about 12 reps. Well, check this out. I also build, so that's a straight direct to calendar closer only model. Well, you might have had the question of, well, what if you have a setter team? Well, I have this. I like to hide these. That's very easy to do. You go to, view, and then you go to group, and you just group the ones. Sometimes I minimize it so it's not distracting. So I have an alternative model here that shows, well, what if we had setters that are dialing the rest of the leads? And so if we go up here, there's 3,000 apps, but a 50% scheduled call rate, so only 15 self-scheduled appointments. Well, if I want to have a setter dial the delta here, which is 1,500, and that's the formula that I pull this down from, I use that to see, well, how much additional revenue and ROAS can we get if we deployed setters? If we have a 30% connection rate, out of the people we get a hold of, about 30% of them, 1 in 3, we set an appointment. 80% show rate, you should have a substantially higher show rate when you have a setter team because there's, you had a qualified conversation, there was a human, there's usually content, all these things. And the close rate is typically higher as well because you're self-qualifying before you put it onto a closer's calendar. So you can see here, wow, okay, well, the ROAS goes up significantly if we deploy some setters here in this setter motion. But look at the total revenue is 1.3. So if I drop down this and I have all views now, well, now I could say this because there's a couple different things we're looking at. Well, if this is the revenue, I could go up here and I could say, okay, well, wait a second. If I drop down to 150, now we're roughly at $1 million. I could add a few extra grand to get it perfect, but it's a waste of time. We're roughly at $1 million. So now let's look at this. We could either get to $1 million a month with 12 closers or 9 closers and about 2 setters. I didn't build the capacity model in this example for setters, but if you just say that, let's say every lead they dial 3 times, they make 100 dials a day, which means they could take 30 new contacts a day times 22 average working days a month is 660. We'll take 1125 divided by 660. That's 1.7. You can't hire a 0.7 of a rep, so you need 2, right? I could do this stuff really fast because I look at it so often, but I could either do 12 closers or 9 closers and 2 setters with technically a higher ROAS because you're not paying more for those leads. Right? So do you see how it informs the decisions that you'd make and the strategy that you deploy? And now I know what that actually looks like, right? And so now the one other concept, let me minimize the setter stuff so it's not, too busy of a model. We'll keep the capacity planning here for a second, but let me show you something. So the next topic I talked about here is operational constraints and dependencies. Here's what I want to show you is one of the biggest things that people make the mistake of when they're actually building the models, which is this. When you're scaling a sales team, it is not a straight line. It's more of a staircase, right? I'll explain what I mean here. If it takes 2 weeks to hire and ramp a sales rep, and I'm not talking about ramping into KPI, I'm talking about to ramp into taking calls. And then you're going to have maybe 30 to 60 days to have a fully stabilized rep. No matter how good they are, you could have hired somebody with a track record. It's going to take 30 to 60 days because pipeline maturity, they need to build a pipeline and give a chance for their, that first batch of leads to come full cycle through a sales cycle. And then they need the repetition because they're learning new product knowledge. There's all of these factors that come into play on any new brand. So 30 to 60 days usually is what we look at to get into a stabilized KPI, which is almost like their full potential, right? Well, check this out. Check this out. If we just used a model like this, which again, for really quick, dirty math, I do use these. But if we just looked at this and said, all right, well, at a 4.5x ROAS, I need, what's that, 175. That's not quite there, so 200. If we're trying to map out what it looks like to get to $1 million a month, right? So it's roughly $225 in ad spend. But I want to point out something that's a really big mistake that even the most sophisticated operators I found forget to include in their budgets and forecasts. Well, this is marketing stuff, right? Now, you may even decide what I'm about to say to do it with the marketing metrics, but the marketing metrics can relative to what I'm talking about, hold constant. You know, you're still going to optimize around those things, but at different levels of scale, of course, your cost per call goes up. All of those things do change. So you may even want to do the same concept I'm talking about for marketing metrics to see the different phases of that. But here's what I'm pointing out. 15% close rate. Well, if we look at the capacity again in that other model, we would go from, I think it was 3 to 12 sales reps. While you're going from 3 to 12 sales rep, let's assume it's over a 90-day or a 4-month period of time. So you've quadrupled the team effectively. Do you think that everyone is going to close every deal at the same close rate through that entire ramping period? Of course not. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that happen. Now, let me show you where companies plateau and go, 2 steps forward for 3 steps back over and over again. And it's this concept. Here's why. A stabilized rep, like I said, they're through training, they're ramped up, they're performing at scale, they've been doing it for a while with you, is going to always perform differently than a ramping closer. And what we typically look at is, it's not a perfect science, but like 65, 70% of the stabilized close rate. So I have these different close rates here. But if the stabilized close rate is 15, the ramping close rate it should be like roughly 10. I think it's maybe 11, a little bit higher than that. I'm being conservative here. If they're far below that at like a 30%, well, it's like they're probably never even, 30% of that, which would be like 4% or something, they're probably never going to hit that. And so here's what is the most important insight for you to have. When you're building these financial models for aggressive scale, rapid scale, instead of like most people, when companies scale slow, they never experience this because they'll hire like 1 rep every few months, which is like doesn't make a material difference. But when you're ramping fast, which is what we all want to do, we want to scale fast, you have to model in different assumption sets to account for the variability in performance on your sales team. And so what I have in this model, and I'll show you what it looks like, is these different assumption sets where the close rates for ramping and stabilized reps are different. And then I have to have an assumption for the amount of the team that's stabilized and the amount of team that's ramping. So what I changed in the model here, you can now see, instead of it just going from live calls to close rate, now it goes to how many of those calls are stabilized rep calls and how many of those calls are ramping rep calls, right? And you have the different close rate assumption. It's just pulling from the assumptions at the top. By the way, I have to anchor that, which is why you see the dollar signs so it doesn't move over time. Look up anchoring if you're not familiar with the concept. But those are the different close rates to show that performance. So let me show you how I would do this without building. I have much more complex models. I want to keep this one simple. Let's say this is where you're at. Let's say this is where you're at, 50 grand. So about $250,000 in revenue. And you want to get to that $1 million mark in 90 days, let's say. Well, actually, let's actually even say, yeah, fine. Not $1 million in 90 days. Let's just say that's the goal for demonstration purposes. Well, let's take, so right now, let's look at the capacity again. You're at 3 closers. Well, you already remember the numbers I said. If you go to a million. So 200 in ad spend gets you to a million. Now you need 12 closers. So you went from 3 to 12 closers. So in that 90-day period, 9 team members were brand new. Remember, I told you it takes over that 60-day mark to start to stabilize a rep. So basically that whole time, and you're not hiring them all at once. So almost that whole time, you have those reps that are ramping. So 9 new reps divided by 12, that means 75% of your team is going to be at this ramping assumption. So the inverse of that means 25% is stabilized. This is just a simple 1 minus this, right? All the blue is an input. The black is a formula. So only 25% of your team is stabilized. 75% is ramping. Check this out. This goes to not only does it mean that you need more ad spend, but the ROAS just dropped. Let me show you what it was. The ROAS just dropped from 5.4 to 4, right? And then you also have to spend more because the actual performance didn't get you to the $1 million a month mark. So that means, okay, let's see how much more you need to spend. 250. Now you're at $1 million again. So you have to spend actually 250 when you factor these different assumption set-ins, and your ROAS goes down. Now, another metric that I don't have in here is the collected dollar per booked call, which you'd also see go down. But what is the main point is that so often when companies aggressively scale, they think is the key word, performance is dropping drastically. And this freaks them out because their marketing metrics, like if I had a cost per acquisition, I guess cost per sale right here. Here, let's see what that looks like. If I go back 1975. So let's go back to so you're at a $1,400 CPA, and once you factor in the different assumptions in, now you're at a almost $2,000 CPA. So when they look at all of these things in their overall CAC, their customer acquisition costs, they see it rapidly rising, they get freaked out and they say, okay, something's not working, let's scale back down. When someone who has the experience running high-intensity sales teams like me, I say, whoa, hold on. Are your marketing metrics the same? Are they roughly the same up here? Yeah, they are. Okay. Is the lead quality drastically changed? No. All right. So it's most likely, and we would have our own reporting to manage the individual reps, it's most likely because all of the ramping reps that are not into stabilized KPI yet are dragging and pulling down the team performance to give an illusion that things are not going well, when in reality, all you have to do is wait, do nothing different, wait like 60 days or so, and imagine they're all into KPI, shoots back up to that same 5.4 ROAS that you had, and I didn't adjust that again, and you need less ad spend to get there, the CPA goes right back down, right? And by the way, like this is on a 15% close rate you're looking at, right? Maybe even after a longer period of time, it goes up more. So that's the main thing I wanted to show here that you don't have without financial models, where it's like you know how many times I've heard in this industry, people say to me, every time I try to scale, our profitability and ROAS drops, and then we stop scaling and go back to what was working. It depends on what the reason that happened, but if it's sales performance alone and you were scaling really fast, it's very possible it was because of the performance delta from the ramping sales reps, right? This is just an example of the types of things that we see by using these financial models. So let me go down and start to wrap up with some really good insights here. So the question becomes, if I'm not comfortable with that, what do I do? Well, you have to set your ramping rules and targets. Maybe that's too drastic for you. You don't have that type of risk tolerance or risk appetite or risk profile. I don't know why I came up with 3 different ways to say the same thing, but it comes down to the risk that you're comfortable with. If that's hard for you to sleep at night and it feels a little bit too volatile, then maybe you don't want to ramp from 4x. Maybe you don't want to 4x your revenue from 250 to $1 million in 90 days. and you do it a lot slower, because again, if you're looking over here, the higher percentage of the team that's stabilized and maintaining performance, the less the performance delta impacts you. Because if only 1 out of 10 team members is at a low close rate, that's 10%. If 9 out of 12 are, that's 75%, like we went over. So you have to decide on what you're comfortable with, and maybe you just end up growing slower. Now, the only other thing I would say, because I had a really good question one time, they said, well, is there any way to like kind of minimize the window of the performance delta of the ramping reps and otherwise get them into stabilized KPI faster? Well, of course, really good onboarding, really good training, speed of implementation, validation goals with your sales directors, meaning that they're working on very specific things with reps that are in ramping and not spending as much time with the stabilized reps. There's a ton of management things we do, but you'll never be able to skip that. You can't just jump over that, right? And so what you can do, if you know how many reps you're going to need and it takes 2 weeks to hire and train them, then you want to hire them 2 weeks prior to them needing to start. And that just overall increases, the speed at which you could scale. Last couple things, ramping KPIs and false negatives. I was just talking about this, right? I just went over all this stuff, but one thing I wanted to say is every company to grow has some sort of reinvestment. If you are a company with heavy CapEx, heavy machinery, maybe the reinvestment to increase output is more machines, right? You have to invest in more machinery. If you're an e-com business or an inventory-based business, maybe you need to, reinvest in inventory along with ad spend and other things. In a sales-driven business, we need to normalize this and understand that performance delta of ramping reps is a part of reinvestment and cannot be avoided. If you have the mentality of, well, I'm just going to wait till I find a rep that's performing at 25% close rate day one, you will slow so freaking fast, and I will scale the hell past you with reps at 10%. Because I just understand it's a part of reinvestment, and I just need to have thick skin during those ramping periods and have clarity on what it means, right? Doesn't mean anything is wrong, and you only know this if you're in the trenches, right? A lot of stuff that I say in this video that I'm going to continue to put out there in this channel, I feel very confident that you haven't heard it anywhere else. And that's what I feel good about, because my commitment is the raw shit, and it's not all of this fluffy stuff that people always talk about, right? All right, so like I was saying, I'll just touch on this. The golden ratio is cost per call versus collected dollar per call. I'm going to maybe save that for another video because there's a whole concept around it, but that is how I manage rep efficiency, to see baselines of where they should be at different phases of ramping. And of course, managing reps, as I just alluded to, I'll do another video about that too. It's a whole other subject. There's a lot of videos I could do about that, but the better you do that, of course, the faster you could ramp into KPI, right? Last thing that I'll say here, I run an outsourced sales management business. Right now, we just do that for the coaching in the SaaS space. Here's the deal. I put this content out there for those who want to do it themselves. And I have a business and a service for those that want me to do it for them. So if you ever watch any of these videos and you say, hey, this guy knows what he's doing and I'd rather him be my sales partner, just do this stuff completely turnkey for us, you can either reach me on my Instagram, I'm very active on, troy.joshua, or there should always be some sort of link in the description below. Again, if you're somebody that's in the trenches and you want to do it yourself, I really hope that you get a ton of value. I'm completely committed to the raw and unfiltered content. Have a great day.